Spencer, so over to you.
Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first of two sessions this month, organised by Edgware United Synagogues to commemorate 150 years of the United Synagogue before the end of the calendar year. You can find the complete biannual programme on our website, www.edgwareu.com, and recorded past sessions at our Edgware US YouTube channel. Tonight's topic is 150 years of United Synagogue architecture, the United Victorian Cathedral Synagogues. Art and religion have traditionally been intertwined for most religions, and the religious influence on architecture in particular has been profound. For Jews, building a fine structure has historically been important since, according to tradition, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, is found wherever there's a minyan. There can be few of us who, when we have visited major cities, have not headed for the famous beautiful synagogues, often called the Great, in those places. From Florence to Budapest, the Dahomey Street Synagogue, from Rome to Paris's Grand Synagogue, and the surprise that awaits us when we enter the 16th century synagogues of Venice, plain from the exterior but magnificent inside, all are major tourist attractions. But we don't have to go to far-flung places abroad to find magnificent synagogues, since we have a plethora of them at home. And tonight we're going to hear about many of them. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Sharman Kadish, who has written widely on Anglo-Jewish history and heritage for over 30 years. Her books include Companion Architectural Guides, Jewish Heritage in England, and Jewish Heritage in Gibraltar, The Synagogues of Britain and Ireland, an Architectural and Social History by Yale University Press, was shortlisted for the American Society of Historians of British Art Prize in 2013. A new edition of her guidebook, Jewish Heritage in Britain and Ireland, was published in 2015 by Historic England. Educated at University College London, St Andrews College Oxford, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, she has taught at universities in both London and Manchester. In 1991, she founded the Working Party on Jewish Monuments in the UK and Ireland, a pressure group campaigning for the protection of historic synagogues, cemeteries, and other sites of Jewish interest in the country. This was the precursor to Jewish Heritage UK, a preservation charity that she founded and directed between 2004 and 2016. Dr. Kadish will now take us on a tour of some of the leading synagogues since the United Synagogue was established in 1870, exploring some examples of the United Victorian Cathedral Synagogues, and trace how this successful type persisted down to the 1960s.
Okay, thank you, Spence. That was a very full introduction. Thank you so much. I just want to say good evening to everybody, and thank you for inviting me. And it's a particular pleasure because I'm actually Edgware born and bred, although today we live in Manchester. So it's a bit of a trip back down memory lane. Anyway, let's get started with the talk. I hope everybody can hear and the equipment all works. Right, this has already been mentioned, hasn't it, in your introduction? The age of emancipation arrived in Europe from the French Revolution of 1789. All over Europe, Jews emerged out of the ghetto, sometimes rapidly, more often fitfully, into the modern world. Newly found Jewish confidence was expressed architecturally in the building of monumental synagogues on the public streets. So here you have the Venice ghetto, the Campo Nuevo, and here we have a monumental synagogue, which you probably will recognize in Germany, in Berlin. From the 1830s, but especially from the 1850s, large-scale synagogues on prominent city centre sites made their appearance, from Berlin to Budapest. And in Rome, shown here, the vast new synagogue was more than a metaphor. It was built on the site of the ancient ghetto, swept away in the new united Italy after 1870. In Britain, even in the medieval period, Jews had never been restricted to a ghetto. Over 200 years after the Cromwellian resettlement, in 1858, Lionel de Rothschild, here he is, finally won his long battle to sit in the British Parliament as a professing Jew. This was a symbolic moment. Jewish emancipation in Britain, unlike elsewhere in Europe, was a gradual evolutionary process that had by then been going on for the best part of the century. This emancipation was reflected in a more confident architecture. The Victorian era of emancipation was the age of the Cathedral Synagogue, referred to on the continent from the 1830s as the Choral Synagogue. This term denotes a big urban synagogue in which formal services were held, featuring a chazan and a choir. The term Cathedral Synagogue seems to have gained currency in England from the 1880s. The Cathedral Synagogues were prestige buildings conceived in the grand manner as symbols of the Jewish presence in the city, a civic function which is as relevant today as when they were first constructed. And this is the New West End Synagogue in a contemporary engraving, which was published in the Builder. The 1870s and the 1880s may be called the golden age of the Cathedral Synagogue in High Victorian Britain. A key factor was the foundation of the United Synagogue as an umbrella organisation for London synagogues. Under the United's deed of foundation and trust, provision was made for the centralisation of resources to finance the construction of new synagogues. Whereas in France and Germany, the impetus to centralisation had come from above, the consistoire in France and the Gemeinden in Germany were structures imposed by the state and communities as a means of political control over a religious minority. In Britain, on the other hand, the United Synagogue was set up by an Act of Parliament initiated by the Jewish community itself. Yet the architectural effects were the same, a building boom and the erection of large-scale synagogues, both in London and for provincial congregations that recognised the jurisdiction of the chief rabbi. The grand so-called Cathedral Synagogue became the architectural type of the United Synagogue. And this picture I've slipped in here is actually of Prince's Road in Liverpool, and you'll see why presently. So what were the characteristics of the so-called Cathedral Synagogues? First of all, let's talk about plan, the plan of the building, the floor plan. Here's St. Petersburg Place again. Typically, the Cathedral Synagogue was built to a basilican plan. The term basilica is mostly associated with Christian buildings in European architectural history. Nevertheless, in the ancient world of both Greece and Rome, synagogues were also built to this plan, and it's still used today. In a basilica, and you can see from this slide, let's see if I can find the pointer here, which I did before, is that right? Pointer options, arrow, here we go. Yeah, you can see that the nave, like the central portion of the building, is higher than the side aisles, which are lower. That's the main characteristic of a basilica, and of course it's an oblong in shape. So it sounds a bit sort of churchy, the word, but it's the term that's used in architectural history. And basically, once you go inside, we're going to the next slide here. Oh, this is I've been a bit naughty here and slipped in another non-United Synagogue in London, which is probably the earliest of the cathedral synagogues which still exist in Britain. Basically, what you have are arcades carrying the ladies' galleries, right, over the side aisles. And of course, this was in addition to the rear gallery, because in the earlier periods, in the Regency and before, most synagogues just had a west gallery at the back, facing the ark. But in the cathedral synagogues, you get galleries all the way around, wrapped all the way around, three sides facing the ark. And of course, the ark wall, as I'm sure everybody here knows, it should be faced towards Jerusalem, which is to the east or the southeast in Britain. Although there are a few cases where this is actually, in fact, a surprising number of cases where this isn't actually so. Above the long north and south walls, right, which is actually, I'll go on to the next slide, which actually shows this, were often was to be found an additional series of small windows up here. This is St. Petersburg Place again, New West End Synagogue, which is called the clerestory or clerestory. Some people pronounce it like that. The clerestory lights to provide extra light inside the building from above. And this basilican plan became a hallmark of the Victorian Cathedral Synagogue, and in fact standard in most purpose-built synagogues down well into the 20th century. Okay, well, what about function? How were the buildings used, and what did they consist of? In the second part of the 19th century, synagogues became larger and more complex buildings. In addition to the traditional adjoining Beis Midrash, I don't know I never know whether I should use Ashkenazi or Sephardi pronunciation when it comes to Hebrew terms or Yiddish terms. So sometimes you've got a Beis Midrash, and you've also got school rooms. And a typical building would include cloakrooms, in St. Petersburg Place again, a vestry, right, offices, and a kitchen. And sometimes there'd be a minister or caretaker's house. I think it's in here in St. Petersburg Place, next door. And I think the minister's house is in the row of houses next door to the building here. But rarely was there a mikveh in the complex, despite the high priority accorded it in Jewish law. The emergence of the Cathedral Synagogue went hand in hand with the development of the Minhag Anglia, the Anglo-Jewish Rite, I suppose we translate it as, in reality imported from Germany by the chief rabbis Adler, Father Nathan, especially his son Herman, who dominated the religious life of Anglo-Jewry during the reign of Queen Victoria. Adlerian orthodoxy meant traditional Jewish content dressed up in English packaging. Top hats and dog collars worn by clergy, professional chazonim, leading choral services, as we mentioned, and I was pleased to see that Raymond Apple was talking about chazonas, which is fits quite well, I think, as sort of complementary subjects. And generally decorous proceedings in an aesthetically pleasing environment. This was a formula calculated to appeal to English-born Jews. The recipe was effective. It staved off the inroads of Reform Judaism until well into the 20th century. That's another story. It says here, this is the Central Synagogue, the old Central Synagogue, which we'll also talk about a bit more later on, showing all the gents in their top hats. Okay, what about architectural style? Jewish emancipation coincided with the age of historicism in architectural history, a period when Europe as a whole looked to the past for inspiration, to classical, Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque revival styles. Paradoxically, it was also a period of great technological advance, when new materials such as cast iron were put to use in the reinterpretation of traditional styles. In architectural history, the middle of the 19th century is often called the era of the Battle of the Styles. All over Europe, Jewish emancipation, whether actual or aspirational, triggered the search for a Jewish style of architecture, or at least an architectural style deemed appropriate for the Jews. The style chosen should be capable of constructing a modern Jewish identity in the context of an open society. Before we go on, and this is Middle Street in Brighton, by the way. I'm being naughty again, because it's such a lovely building that you could feast your eyes on it, and we've got quite a mixture of styles in it too. But before we go and look at this style a bit more, I want to introduce to you some of the architects who designed the synagogues, the cathedral synagogues, and in particular those of the United Synagogue in the 19th century. For the first time since ancient times, emancipation in the 19th century presented opportunities for Jews to become architects. However, the majority of big synagogues in Western countries were still designed by Christians until well on into the century. In the 1830s, David Makata was the first Anglo-Jewish architect, on the blue plaque, who designed synagogues. He is better known for his railway stations. Makata came from one of the old Sephardi families who had established themselves in England in the 17th century. The first generation of Anglo-Jews who entered the architectural profession in any significant numbers arose a little later. H.H. Collins, N.S. Joseph, Davison Emmanuel, and Edward Salomons. Nathan Solomon Joseph was brother-in-law of the chief rabbi. It's always good to have connections, especially family connections. And he became the first architect surveyor to the United Synagogue. He was the founder of something of an architectural dynasty that continued to design for the United Synagogue well into the 20th century. Nathan's nephew, Delissa Joseph, designed, well, his best known building, which still survives, is Hampstead Synagogue in Dennington Park Road. But Hampstead, although massive in scale, really belongs to a slightly later era than the classic Cathedral Synagogue. So I'm not really going to talk about, because it needs quite a bit of explaining actually, which we haven't really got time for this evening. On the whole, more prolific than his uncle, Delissa's synagogues were far more eclectic, consequently architecturally less successful, one could argue. Delissa's talents lay elsewhere, and he became more widely known for offices and hotels built over underground stations in Edwardian London. In the interwar period, Nathan Joseph's son Ernest shared his commitment to Jewish affairs and synagogue building, but is chiefly remembered for the design of the Art Deco Chelmex House on London's Embankment in the 1930s. Returning to the Victorian age, as the 19th century progressed, the coterie of emerging Jewish architects were given unprecedented opportunities for new commissions. Like their Christian colleagues, they experimented with a range of styles, and more often than not, as we'll see, with a mixture of styles within the same building. In fact, few cathedral synagogues would claim architectural purity. Eclecticism was rife. So we'll now look at some examples of synagogues built by some of these architects for the United after 1870 and down to the end of Queen Victoria's reign in 1901. First of all, I suppose, if we look at style, the first style which became popular really in the mid-19th century was what's called the Italianate style, which had been made fashionable in the 1830s by John Davis's London New Synagogue, which is shown in this engraving. And that was in Great St Helens in Bishopsgate. It was opened in 1838, a year after Queen Victoria came to the throne. And this synagogue was one of the founder members of the United Synagogue and the precursor of the Stamford Hill New Synagogue in Egerton Road that still survives today as the Bobova Hasidic Shul. Many architects travelled to Italy on the Grand Tour, including David Mercator and the second professing Jewish architect, Hyman Henry Collins. Collins designed a series of predominantly Italianate synagogues in London, all of which joined the United after it was founded. This is the Borough Synagogue in Walworth, which was actually effectively the first United synagogue south of the River Thames, which no longer exists. And it was followed by North London Synagogue, Lofting Road in Barnsley, not areas which we think really now associate with large Jewish or even small Jewish communities. But he also designed St John's Wood United Synagogue, or at least the building that started out as St John's Wood United Synagogue in Abbey Road, but of course is now better known as the New London Synagogue, which is very near the Abbey Road studios. Of course, it survived, but without its corner turrets. So Renaissance style became quite popular for synagogues until well into the 20th century. Oh, here we go. Right, so let's go on now from the Italianate to the Romanesque revival. Romanesque, for those who have done their art and architectural history, it's basically round arches, means round arches, and as the name implies, goes back to the Romans, as opposed to the Greeks in Europe. And it's associated mostly in England with the Norman conquest. The Romanesque, in fact, had long roots in Europe, and the relics of several Norman stone houses that may have been owned or occupied by Jews in the medieval pre-expulsion period were known in the 19th century, especially the Jews' House and Jews' Court in Lincoln, which is worth a visit if anybody we can ever get out of London again or out of Manchester. It's an interesting place to visit. The basilican plan, with vaulted nave or an open timbered roof, a gallery, arcades, and clerestory, is characteristic of the medieval Romanesque in religious buildings all over Europe, and was thus ideally suited to the new cathedral synagogues. And so features include particularly paired round-headed windows, and you can see that they've survived on the Jew's house here, underneath a little double window underneath the archway, the round arch. A big rose window, a big round window or wheel window, what's called relieving arches and recessed doorways. Let's actually go on to the next slide here, because you can see some of these features here. Recessed doorways here with the round arches, and sometimes clustered columns were features of many a synagogue facade in the second half of the 19th century. And this example is actually the Bayswater Synagogue. Somebody said there's something on. Please move the window away. Is that okay? That's all right now. Everybody can see the slides. Yeah, Bayswater Synagogue was demolished in the 1960s to make way for the widening of the Harrow Road. You can see from this that you've got the double-headed round windows on the upper floor, and they're paired, and you've got the round-headed double doorways with sort of Norman columns, which are probably more, if you're into this, probably more particularly Italian, it's called Lombardic Romanesque, so from northern Italy. And in fact, if you look more carefully at Bayswater, it's not a pure Romanesque building. In fact, contemporary commentators, like the experts in the builder, judged it as being a bit of a cross between Italianate and Romanesque. And certainly the proportion of the facade, its prominent cornice here, is perhaps reminiscent of a palazzo, like in Venice, Venetian palazzo. And these, what's called voussoirs, these little, this is incidentally one of the only photographs of the building, and it's black and white. We guess it is probably red and yellow, these little bricks at the top of the windows, decorative bricks. Also sort of a reminiscent of Venice, but although perhaps more of the Venetian Gothic than the Renaissance or Romanesque. So that such mingling of styles was typical of the age. And I had a picture of the interior there, which I ran ahead on. Bayswater was one of the 5 founding members of the United Synagogue in 1870, along with its West End neighbour, the Central Synagogue, which we'll come back to, and the original city synagogues, the Great, the New, and the Hambro, were the 3 original Ashkenazi synagogues in London. Of course, the oldest synagogue in the country is Bevis Marks, which is the Sephardi, Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. Bayswater was built in 1862-3, and it was the first synagogue designed by Nathan Joseph, who rose to prominence over the next decade. But at Bayswater, he was subordinate to the more experienced Mancunian, Edward Salomons. Indeed, Salomons was one of Joseph's proposers for membership of what became the Royal Institute of British Architects. Right, okay, so that's a little bit about Italianate and Romanesque. But the style that became most closely associated with synagogues in the late 19th century, there's a little plug for my book here, but it shows, the cover shows this, was the so-called Oriental style. In synagogue architecture, Orientalism enjoyed a vogue all over Europe in the second half of the 19th century. The style was rarely pure, but an eclectic mix of Moorish, sometimes called Moresque or Saracenic, Islamic, Byzantine, and even Assyrian or Indian-inspired styles, sporting domes, turrets, and minarets. Few Orientalist synagogues had pretensions to architectural purity. Nevertheless, they made a confident statement of newly emancipated Jewry's supposedly Eastern origins. The term Orientalism itself was never used at the time. Professional journals and the press characterized such synagogues, certainly as Moresque, Saracenic, or Byzantine. But we know that from the early 19th century, the Orient became a theme in literature and art. Only in the late 20th century did Orientalism become a fashionable label for the 19th century fascination with the Orient. When Oriental style first emerged for synagogues in Germany from the 1830s, it was considered appropriate for and imposed upon Jews by state authorities and their Christian architects. The fashion began with the interior of the Dresden Synagogue by the prestigious German Protestant architect Gottfried Semper. In Semper's mind, and in that of many of his contemporaries, Jews were linked with the Arab world of North Africa and the Middle East. Yet by the end of the century, Orientalism had been taken up with enthusiasm by Jewish communities all over the continent as a badge of emancipated pride. In the context of 19th century Europe, the point of such exotic styles was that they were demonstrably different. Synagogues in Oriental style could never be mistaken for churches. The fashion for minarets, this is Prince's Road in Liverpool again. I've got a message at the top of my screen again. Please move this window away. I hope other people can't see it. My screen sharing is, but anyway, I'll carry on regardless. I don't know if I can move that away. Never mind. Okay. The fashion for minarets in 19th century synagogue architecture was probably started by Ludwig von Forster's vast Doheny temple in Budapest, which I think was mentioned at the beginning, which I'm sure lots of people visited. It was known as the Tabat Temple at the time. And of course, it was lovingly restored by the World Monuments Fund, is now a major tourist site. But Forster's slightly earlier synagogue, the Temple of Gaza synagogue here in Vienna, which no longer exists, also had turrets. There, in the context of a much simpler tripartite facade. Again, you see the nave higher than the side bays. This tripartite form, with or without turrets, was to become one of the most enduring features of 19th century synagogue architecture. And here we have it in another drawing of St. Petersburg Place. According to fashionable archaeological theory, the tripartite front imitated the appearance of the Temple of Solomon, the Beis Hamikdash, while the pair of turrets were reminders of the portal columns named in the Book of Kings, Jachin and Boaz. In Britain, in the 1860s, was a period of intensive archaeological exploration in Jerusalem, led by the British Royal Engineers under Charles Warren and Sir Charles Wilson. The British Palestine Exploration Fund, a fund, was founded in 1866 with Wilson as its first director. And the findings were published in a series of illustrated books over the following decade. An even more important source for Orientalist-style synagogues was medieval Spain. In the 1830s, French and British artists discovered Andalusia. Depictions of the famous Alhambra, the Red Palace of Granada, were made in watercolour and engravings by the two Scottish artists, David Wilkie and David Roberts. I'm sure people are familiar with David Roberts. The American traveller Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra carried a dedication to his friend David Wilkie. Owen Jones, the famous British designer, spent 6 months drawing at the Alhambra and published the results as lithographs in a monumental series of folios. He made detailed studies of the complex, both the palace and the fortress, which were published between 1836 and 1845. And he also travelled in Egypt and Turkey, as well as in Spain. And all this fed into his design drawings, because he was most best known as a designer of textiles, wallpaper, tiles and mosaics. And he left a lasting legacy in his best-selling textbook called Grammar of Ornament. Powerful symbol of the medieval Moorish domination of Spain and its last stronghold, the Alhambra was also the setting for the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. This was a fact apparently lost on the 19th century Orientalist writers, artists and architects, Jews included. It's a matter of irony here, as is the whole idea about Orientalism. An interesting, the whole concept is interesting as applied to Jews. Received opinion hitherto has been that Moorish-style synagogues in Britain were influenced by images of the Alhambra, this is the Court of the Lions in the Alhambra, but not by the former synagogues of medieval Spain. in Toledo, what's called by the names of the churches that they were converted into: Santa Maria la Blanca, which is the Ibn Shasham Synagogue, shown here, El Transito, the Abulafia Synagogue, and the Little Synagogue in Cordova. Because these, compared with the Alhambra, were little known in their day. However, when I was doing my research for what I call my big book, I discovered that, in fact, major Spanish surveys, which were also published in big folios, which are found in the British Library, in the 1840s and 50s, actually included the synagogues of Toledo, and that these were reproduced in the 1860s by an architectural historian and writer called James Ferguson, in a popular work called The History of Architecture in All Countries, which was very, very widely distributed. And many British architects used it. And British drawn lithographs also appeared in a little book by a gentleman called E.H. Lindo, who was a member of the Sephardi community, who wrote a history of the Jews of Spain and Portugal, which was published in 1848. And that's where this particular drawing was taken from. So Spain was better known, certainly in Jewish circles, than has been hitherto thought. Oriental style spread across Europe and even reached Liverpool. Oh, this is from my original edition of the guidebook in Liverpool's Capital of Cultures. Right, the golden age of Orientalism in synagogue architecture in 19th century Europe coincided with advances in building technology. Structural cast iron was first really used in the 1850s and 60s and became the norm for the column supports carrying the arches and the galleries of basilican synagogues in the next decade. As actually Prince's Road in many ways shows this very clearly. The strength of the new material meant that thick masonry columns could be replaced by slim rods of iron. So instead of thick columns, you've got very, very thin, hollow columns with iron, masking iron. And this allowed for the use of delicate Moorish forms, the slender columns and the horseshoe arches, inspired by the architecture of Andalusia. And Prince's Road is also a very good example because it's got polychromic decoration. It's completely covered in stenciling all over, especially on the ceiling. And this was something which was very fashionable on the continent, but less so in England. In fact, there were certainly none of the surviving synagogues in Britain, other than Prince's Road, are examples of this. So that's why I put this in. Again, the stenciling, a lot of the patterning came was inspired by the Alhambra and Andalusia. Berlin Temple became the most celebrated expression of Orientalism in synagogue architecture in the second half of the 19th century. The synagogue on Oranienburger Strasse, which if anyone's been to Berlin, they'll see how it dominates the skyline, was designed by another German Protestant architect called Edward Knoblauch. And it was the largest synagogue in the world when it was completed in 1866. It could hold 3,000 people. The huge gilded dome became a prominent city landmark. It was reputedly modelled on John Nash's Brighton Pavilion at the shape. Key elements of the front elevation were to be replicated in many lesser synagogues all over Europe and beyond, well into the 20th century. The triple arcaded entrance porch, you can't actually see it's such a high elevation, it's quite a narrow street, flanked by a pair of turrets, which we've got here, over the stairwells. And then you've got the little domes on the top. In 1866, to relate this back to Britain, the United Synagogue, the Illustrated London News published an engraving of the interior of the Neues Synagogue, the Berlin Synagogue, that was, in the estimation of the Building News, one of the contemporary architectural journals, one of the handsomest buildings in Germany. This illustration proved to be the turning point in the advent of Orientalism in British synagogue architecture. Anglo-Jewish architects, like the average architect in England, may not have kept abreast of the latest theoretical debates and architectural trends on the continent, especially if they were written up in German, French, and Russian. But at the very least, they would have flicked through the pages of the Illustrated London News. So it's a sort of Instagram of its day, I suppose. Nathan Solomon Joseph was the greatest champion of Moorish style synagogues in England and employed it on his first solo commission, which was the building of the newly named Central Synagogue in London, of course, which opened in 1870, of course, the year the United Synagogue was founded. And he informed the building committee of the Central that the Moresque was the most appropriate style for synagogue architecture, given its Eastern origin. In fact, the Central was the first thoroughly Oriental style synagogue, both outside and in Britain. The plan of the Central was a true cathedral synagogue with nave, lower side aisles, and clerestory. And you can see all the characteristics in this engraving. The vaults and galleries were carried on slender ironwork horseshoe columns. Each roundel of the clerestory windows actually had a Magen David in it, which again was probably a first as well. And that's Jewish symbolism. The use of Magen Davids and things is a whole discussion which we can have. The arch end featured a lobed arch, curly bits all the way around, and it was in the shape of a horseshoe, which you can see here. And the top lit apse, which contain the ark, was stuccoed in a kind of a diamond pattern, typical of medieval Spain, of the kind of this is another view of the other side of the Central Synagogue. Where are we? I think we are. I think. Yes, right. From the outset, the Central was intended to be the Cathedral Synagogue of the metropolis and the cornerstone of the Union of the London Community, which became the United Synagogue. And the Central followed the Great, the Hambro, the New, and the Bayswater as the fifth constituent of the United Synagogue. Accommodating over 1,000 people, its construction was testimony to the decisive and irreversible shift from the east to the west in the power structure of London Jewry, because the geography of, we talk about the East End and the West End, the Great and Bevis Marks were centred in Aldgate on the edge of the city of London, and then gradually as the Jews prospered, people moved to the West End. The final cost of the Central, that ran well over budget, was the then colossal amount of £37,000, most of which was subscribed by the wealthy West End Jewish public. The first Jewish MP, Baron Lionel de Rothschild, laid the foundation stone in March 1869. From lowly origins in the Frankfurt ghetto, the Judengasse in Frankfurt, 19th century painting of it, the House of Rothschild rose to become bankers to kings, with branches in Paris, Vienna, Naples, and London. Their conspicuous wealth was put into fine houses and art collections. The Rothschilds were the benefactors supreme of the Jewish community, funding Jewish schools, hospitals, orphanages, and old age homes, as well as synagogues. The aged Lionel's brother, Sir Anthony de Rothschild, together with banker Lionel Lewis Cohen, were prime movers in both the building of the Central and in the foundation of the United Synagogue. So the patrons are extremely important. The new Central Synagogue opened on the 7th of April, 1870, and it was destroyed in an air raid on the 10th of May, 1941. And it was rebuilt in a modern idiom after the war in Great Portland Street. However, if you take a walk around the back of today's Central Synagogue to the offices at the back of the building on Hallam Street, you can still see Joseph's original Moorish horseshoes and what's called Islamic ogive shaped arches on the doors and window heads. And again, we've got the red and yellow voussoirs, the decorative brickwork, which is a sort of quintessentially more Moorish. If anyone's been to the great mosque in Cordova, the patterning is like that. So that was quite an interesting discovery, actually, when we looked at, because most of our survey was of pre-Second World War buildings, and so initially the Central Synagogue wasn't included. So it was quite a surprise. We walked around the other side and found these windows. The new West End Synagogue in Bayswater is the United Synagogue's finest and sole surviving Orientalist building. This synagogue actually has a big sister, Liverpool's Prince's Road, which is another reason why I keep showing you Prince's Road, which was also designed by the same architect, George Audsley. Both buildings now enjoy the highest grade 1 status, which means that they're on a par with Westminster Abbey and St Paul's as landmarks. The new West End in St Petersburg Place stands only a short distance from the Greek church, the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Moscow Road, which was built at exactly the same time. In a neighbourhood, Bayswater, an affluent neighbourhood, which, like Liverpool's then very leafy Toxteth, was stuffed with expensive churches. Toxteth, incidentally, is now being regenerated. So it's interesting. The site of the new West End was purchased with the help, once again, of the Rothschilds and a loan from the United Synagogue. The building was consecrated by the chief rabbi in 1879 at a final cost of just under £25,000, including the site. So, which interestingly was a bit less than the Central Synagogue. The new West End was built for the social elites of West End Jewry, and its lavishness befitted their wealth. Echoes of Berlin and Budapest can be seen in both London and in Liverpool, because you've got, and here's a comparison here, you've got the turrets, right? Of course, Prince's Road lost their turrets in the 1960s because they were deemed unsafe. But you can actually see quite a lot of parallels between Prince's Road and St Petersburg Place, because you've got they're both sort of red bricky fronts. They've got the corner turrets. They've got the wheel window here, big window, and they've got the horseshoe archway, several orders, like deep set archway with a sort of slightly pointed horseshoe arch in the middle. And once you get inside, here again we can compare the two buildings, the parallels continue. You've got a barrel vaulted ceiling in both cases. You've got cast iron arches here with the slender arch, the slender columns carrying horseshoe arches. You've got a big arch over the Aron Kadish in each building. The Liverpool one is cusped; it's got these little curls in it, whereas the one in Bayswater is sort of plainer. And it's got, above all, they've both got these very lavish arcs, which are sort of Assyrian style. Perhaps we won't, but again, a mixture of styles of, but basically Orientalist, whatever that means. Let's go back to that slide there. Oh no, actually that one, yes, shows St Petersburg Place, the arc there, more close-up view. Okay, so that's Orientalism in the 19th century cathedral synagogues. Now I'm going to make a big jump, because I don't know how we're doing for time, but we're going to have time for any questions. So I'm basically jumping over the interwar period, and I'm going to go to the 1960s, and then I'm going to say a little bit about today. Okay. So in the 1960s, after the Second World War, as the construction industry came out of austerity, the United Synagogue persisted in its traditional policy, established in the 1870s, of building in the grand manner. The Victorian Cathedral Synagogue was updated with a contemporary twist. And by the 1960s, new materials and construction methods were being used in the design of synagogues, such as reinforced concrete, steel, plate glass, and curtain walling. And the decor was jazzed up with sort of 60s features, like chrome light fittings, and I think I'm disappearing off the screen, colourful abstract mosaics, and stained and coloured glass in geometric designs. And here we have a bit of a contrast. Marble Arch Synagogue is one of the best and most prestigious examples of the United Synagogue in the 1960s. It opened in 1961, seating more than 1,000 people, and it cost $500,000 to build. The Mile End business tycoon Charles Claw headed the list of donors and laid the foundation stone. The architect was Sir Thomas Bennett, for 10 years ahead of the School of Architecture and Building at the Northern Polytechnic, which I think is now part of, I don't know, Westminster. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody can tell me afterwards. T.P. Bennett and Son was a highly successful commercial practice, popular particularly with developers and with strong links to the British establishment. They had a large portfolio of blocks of flats, especially in the West End and Northwest London, offices, shops, banks, and cinemas. The rectangular and galleried interior of Marble Arch has very little natural light. There's another view that's looking towards the Arc, and here's looking the other way. It's got a lot of stained glass done by different people, but I just want to get a general sense of the building. And it's hidden away. It's a bit of a surprise because it's hidden behind the rather discreet curved porticoed frontage, in keeping with the listed Regency Crescent on Great Cumberland Place, which I think is now Wallenberg Place, isn't it? I think they've changed the name of it in honour of Wallenberg. And in fact, the synagogue itself got listed by what's now Historic England, almost by accident. In 2014, Westminster Council ruled that the listing, which had been ambiguous up until that point, does in fact extend to the interior, making Marble Arch one of only 3 listed post-war synagogues in the country. It's the only one in London to date. And I have to say that if I'd have been asked which building would you give the best and worthy of listing, I would have chosen Marble Arch. So it's quite fortuitous. Okay, so that's Marble Arch Synagogue in the 1960s. And I'm just going to a few more words about the relevance of cathedral synagogues. Because in the late 20th century, the Cathedral Synagogue fell victim to changing fashion. They were usually, these type of buildings are usually built with excellent acoustics, designed for the choral services, led by the cousin and choir, that were characteristic of the musical tradition of the Minhag Anglia. And of course, but unfortunately, Chazonis also went out of fashion. This is actually a 1920s synagogue in Manchester, which is showing one of the last choral services, which was held in Manchester a few years ago. In the late 19th century, both the buildings, the cathedral shawls, and the chazonis that accompanied them were regarded as alien by new immigrants from traditional Yiddish-speaking communities in Eastern Europe, because obviously there was a big immigration in the late 19th century. Just like the terms Minhag Anglia and the Englische Schule, today the very name Cathedral Synagogue has in some quarters become a term of abuse. As a product of Jewish emancipation in Europe in the 19th century, it is regarded as an outdated and irrelevant symbol of the emancipation experiment that ended in the Holocaust. Empty edifices dot the landscape of Europe as potent reminders not only of the physical destruction of Jewish life during the Second World War, but of the self-inflicted spiritual destruction wrought by assimilation and defection. Resurgent Orthodox communities are, however, intent on recreating the lost world of pre-war Europe in Israel and America, and the great Jewish centers, and also recreating the great Jewish centers of learning in Lithuania, Poland, and Galicia, both Hasidic and non-Hasidic. These sort of communities are being consciously reproduced in Brooklyn, in Bnei Brak, and in Stamford Hill, and perhaps even in Edgware and North Manchester. And here, Gateshead, this is actually the old Gateshead synagogue shown here, which has now been redeveloped. But like all restoration projects, this new Jewish world is a partially artificial creation. The synagogue type that the Haredim, the strictly Orthodox, have by and large chosen to adopt is that of the Hasidic shtibel, the small prayer room or conventicle, in preference to the large purpose-built synagogue, which was historically just as much a feature of Jewish life from the Middle Ages onwards in towns and villages in which Jews traditionally lived. And we have an example here. In recent years, this is a synagogue in Poland that's been restored in Zamość, one of the fortress synagogues, the rock fortress synagogues of 17th century Poland, just to show you that large-scale buildings existed side by side with small, rooms and Stiebler in informal settings. In recent years, mainstream Anglo Jewry, as epitomised by the United Synagogue, has taken its cue from the Haredi world. Post-war synagogues in Britain have become less architecturally ambitious and more utilitarian, with movable seating rather than fixed pews. This, of course, reflects wider trends in the design of places of worship of all faiths. But it's also indicative of an emotional search for spiritual intimacy, which the big formal synagogue space seems not to satisfy. There is a feeling amongst younger Jews searching for their religious roots that the modest, sparsely furnished and undecorated Stiebel is somehow more authentically Jewish, redolent of Yiddishkeit, traditional Judaism, and the big shul. But as we can see here, the evidence of archaeology and architectural history both contradict this perception. In the past, Jews did build big synagogues whenever the opportunity arose, in modern times in particular, as an expression of newly won freedom in the 19th century. In the 21st century, the Victorian Cathedral Synagogues that are still in use are as relevant as when they were first built. As rare survivals, they are gradually coming to be cherished as heritage buildings, even if the best of their suburban descendants, built in the Edwardian and interwar period, have not yet won that particular battle. This is the Clapton Federation Synagogue, half demolished a few years ago. Perhaps, like people, buildings need to reach the ripe old age of 100 in order to be appreciated. In today's troubled world, the power of landmark Jewish heritage buildings to foster better inter-community relations should not be underestimated. Terrorist attacks, not only on synagogues, but on places of worship of all faiths, have focused attention on the importance of improving intercommunal relations. And this can be achieved by simple events that cost little money. During the annual Heritage Open Days, but alas, not this year because of the pandemic, members of the public have had the opportunity to visit the worship spaces of a different faith group for the very first time, besides a chance to be inspired by the architectural beauty of a religious building. For the Jewish community itself, the Big Shul remains extremely useful as a default venue for public events, such as civic services, presentations, armistice and Holocaust Remembrance Days. As back in the 19th century, today the historic synagogue serves as the flagship public face of Jewry and its interface with the wider world. And finally, just one final thought. In the era of the pandemic, the advantages of large spaces in which congregations can pray while keeping a safe social distance from one another has become apparent to everyone. Thank you. Right, there we go. There.
Well, thank you for that very thorough and comprehensive tour of the synagogues. I'm sure there are lots of questions that people would like to ask. So either put something into the chat or raise your virtual hand or indicate with your actual hand and we'll call on you.
So we've got one question already from Tony. I'll just unmute his line.
How are we doing this? Are people asking the questions, or is it?
So a combination. I'll say we've got. Tony, I'm trying to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself now. You've got a question.
Tony, can you go to the left-hand side and unmute?
Oh, yeah, you're muted, I think.
Yeah. Or if not, put the question in chat if you can't unmute. Okay, we'll see if anyone else has got any questions. If you want to put questions in the chat as well, or you can put up your virtual hand.
Anyone? No. Well, could I ask you whether, because we have a chazan but no instruments, whether the architects were asked to take the acoustics into account so that the chazanim could sing properly?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that certainly the Minhag Anglia, was and not only in Britain though, but in all over Europe, there was an emphasis on having aesthetically pleasing services. So you've got the building, a magnificent building, but you've also got good acoustics, and of course the choir had to be accommodated. And there were various architectural solutions to that and discussions about where the choir was best placed. I know at Edgware, and I remember as a child that the choir used to be, when Manavani sang in Edgware, used to be behind the ark in a very high gallery, which had a net over it, a sort of a kind of mechitza, and used to be right up there in the gods kind of thing. Some of the cathedral synagogues still have. St. Petersburg Place certainly has a choir gallery behind the ark. In other shores, it was behind, was put on the bimah, or behind the bimah, the choir, and sometimes even on the west gallery, like facing the ark. So there were discussions about where was the best place to put the choir. And yes, good acoustics if you've got a lofty ceiling. Obviously, you can have good acoustics in the buildings. That was often very well thought out. Which I have to say is a big contrast to a lot of modern synagogues where it hasn't been properly thought out. You can't always hear very well, the sermon, or somebody, if they're turned away from you, you can't hear what people are saying. So that was definitely something which you find that the major cathedral synagogues tended to have very good acoustics. Let's say here in Manchester, the Clonston Synagogue, which I showed you before, which is sort of fighting for survival in a way. It's now being used by a Haredi community, but they're not using, because there's no chazonos there anymore, and yet the acoustics in that building are excellent. That was built in the end of the 1920s. So you don't really need if they were properly designed, you didn't need to have any kind of amplification. You just have the chazan's voice. So and the choir. So yes, an answer to that question. Anyone? I hope I've answered it. Already gone silent.
So there's a question in the chat.
You mentioned listing of buildings.
Who am I speaking to? Hello.
Spencer here again.
Oh, hello. Yes. Yeah, I can't see you on the screen now.
You mentioned listing of buildings. I think Dollis Hill was listed after the war because it was the first building shot in reinforced concrete or something like that.
Oh, Dollis Hill. It's I didn't choose do any 1930s buildings. But actually, funnily enough, the last talk I gave was to the 20th Century Society, and they used Dollis Hill on their poster to advertise it. And it was a building that excited both architects and engineers, because the designer was Owen Williams, who specialised in motorways and bridges. And it was you're right, in a way it was concertina. It's not actually the material, but the way the concrete was treated, with this sort of concertina front that made it into a sort of a first. It was all painted, whitewashed in a very sort of pared down look. I have to say it was never much liked by the congregation. And in fact, they gradually sort of changed the interior, because it was very stark, the building. I suppose quite cold, really. But it was, and it's probably the only really, of course it's now the school, the Torah Tamima Primary School, but the only really radical building which went up in Britain, a synagogue in the 1930s, compared with some of the stuff which was being done on the continent. So, but whether it worked well as a synagogue, it's now a school. But yes, and that is actually grade 2 listed, that building. Yes, it is. But of course, it's a synagogue now. So.
We now have a question from Susan Freed. Do you want to ask it, or shall we read it to you? She asks, how often were tefillot held in these magnificent shuls did daily services take place?
How often did? So I didn't catch it all.
Where tefillot held in these magnificent shuls did daily services take place?
How often did well, this I think is probably the premise behind the question is the cathedral synagogues being associated with laxity of religious observance. And actually, in the 19th century, sociological studies have been done. There was a census of religious worship amongst all based denominations, which is basically Christian denominations and Jews, in 1851. where they did a census of how many people were in the building. And actually, the large central, big urban synagogues were well used, because don't forget, it was a religious age, and that if you wanted to be a respectable person, then you would attend the synagogue, as the your Christian citizens in the neighborhood would be attending church. So it's only really, I suppose, as communities declined and people moved away from the neighborhoods, that in Britain, you see, in Europe, you had the obviously, the Second World War and Kristallnacht and everything, the destruction of the big synagogues. But here it was more suburbanization. They were victims of suburbanization, of people moving out of the central London neighborhoods or central metropolis, where like places like Tottenham became inner city, and people moved to the suburbs. So the synagogues became less and less used, and the congregations dwindled.
Question from Russell Grossman.
Oh, hello, Russell.
Yeah, so he said, where a building is listed and the synagogue then falls into disuse, what issues does this present, and is the listing a blessing or a curse?
Oh well, this is where we start getting very political. Well, it's probably both, but the listing of synagogues can be a blessing, and certainly in the sense of keeping heritage buildings going. And but of course, we recognise that there are times when you can't keep a building going in its original use. And of course, there's a whole sort of hierarchy of what the preferable alternative uses are. I think one of the biggest myths about listing is that you can't do anything to the building, which actually isn't true. All it means is that you have to apply for planning permission, or what's called listed building consent, which is like parallel to planning, in order to make alterations to it. And the big challenge, not only for synagogues, but for all historic places of worship, is how to make them relevant to and fit for use in the 21st century. So finding a lot of the work that I was involved with in the past, I'm not now, but was working with Historic England, or what was an English Heritage, and various church conservation societies to find uses for historic places of worship. And sometimes they go out of use, trying to find the least unsympathetic, or find the most sympathetic use for the building. And of course, there's a sort of hierarchy of uses, converted into a museum, of course, which is not actually very, very difficult. People say, "Oh, could our synagogue become a museum?" And I would actually say, no, that's not a very good idea, because outside London, even the Manchester Jewish Museum is struggling. It's not something that's economically viable. And converted to other uses, the ideal is to find a heritage use, which is also for conservation and development to go hand in hand. So some of the most successful projects are where buildings have been integrated in regenerated neighbourhoods. And some of the cases that I'm sort of go back 30 years, somewhere like Singers Hill in Birmingham, which I showed you earlier, that was really written off as all the Jews had moved away from that part of Birmingham, and they'd all moved to the suburbs, and so nobody was interested in Singers Hill. And some enthusiasts got the building. It was listed, and it was upgraded to 2-star. And then, of course, maybe about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, the area around there, which is quite close to New Street Station, started to be regenerated. And they've been building like city flats, and they've made a whole development called the Mailbox, which is all sort of cafe. Oh, in the days before COVID, of course, cafes and restaurants, and by the canals. And it's become, and the irony is that the Singers Hill is now the thriving shul in Birmingham, whereas the suburban synagogue in Pershore Road have actually downsized. So So when you work in heritage and conservation, you have to think very long term about buildings. Of course, in the short term, why listing has not been popular from the point of view of synagogue organisations, and of course the United Synagogue being chief amongst us, when the dilemma of communities shifting, and of course particularly London Jew has been notorious in moving from one neighbourhood to the next, usually driven by property prices. So the younger people can't afford what the parents, Golders Green became too expensive, so people moved to Edgware, and now Edgware is too expensive, so the young people have moved out to Bushey and Radlett and things. And you want to provide the services, literally services, but or facilities for those young communities. So the historic building in the city centre was seen as a sort of a millstone around the neck of the organisation, or because listing reduces the commercial value of a building. And that's basically, again, this is not just synagogues, this is all across the board. So the best thing to do, which is why we did our original survey of the Jewish built heritage, which was supported by the Heritage Lottery Fund and English Heritage, going back to the mid-1990s, was to survey the stock of buildings and to try and protect those buildings, which the best ones, to guard against them being sold off at short notice, kind of thing. Because there were cases where, and I can think, for example, of Wilston, and I remember we surveyed the Wilston Synagogue, which was a 1930s building in Heathfield Crescent or Heathfield Gardens, which is a Bronsbury Park, and because the community had dwindled, this was in, mid-1990s. And then about 10 years later, it was sold off. It's very sad, really, because it was designed by a major German Jewish refugee architect who designed buildings in Augsburg, in Bavaria, and in Saxony. It was quite an interesting building. It's been absolutely kind of ruined now. But the irony is that round the corner, lo and behold, in the community hall, which was built in the 1960s, started a new kahila of young people who'd moved back to Wilston because it was cheaper than the other northwest London suburbs, and are now redeveloping that as their new synagogue. And they could have had this really nice 1930s stylish Art Deco building, which has now become a sort of a low church. I think it's a black church there, and of course the black churches are not the slightest bit interested in architecture. So yeah, so although in the short term it could be seen as listings, could be seen as a kind of a problem, if you like. If you in the longer term, and this is like sort of if we talk about politics and what people's immediate economic interests are, and the longer term environmental issues and stuff, the things which politicians don't usually care about because they're going to be out of office before the climate warms up so much that they won't be to blame. So there we are. There is a conflict between conservation and development, and it's always been there and always will be there. But there is a place for retaining some of the heritage because it's because the heritage of the community, particularly for a minority community, and of the country as a whole. If we all left tomorrow, the buildings would still be there.
Right. So we got about 4 or 5 other questions.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, sorry, we got about 4 or 5 other questions.
A philosophical discussion we can have about this. But.
Right. Well,
yes.
Malcolm Cowan is next.
Yeah, I'm going to do Malcolm next, then Malcolm, then Jonathan, then Susan.
Oh, we've got lots of people now.
We've got lots of questions. So Malcolm, Cowan, hopefully
could you unmute yourself, Malcolm?
Is on mute.
Yeah, good evening, that's Kadish.
Is that Malcolm Cowan or Malcolm Lawrence?
Malcolm Cowan.
Cowan, hello.
Once I realised that most of your research was on the United Synagogue premises, I wondered if you'd done any research into premises in the north of England. As an ex-Mancunian, I'm obviously very familiar with Manchester, and I was saddened to hear about Higher Crumsall Schule, which is in fact where my parents were married
Oh,
many
really?
years ago.
Yeah.
I wondered if you considered looking at, say, the Holy Law Shul, Central Shul, which used to be on Haywood Street, Queen's Road, which is Sephardi, and also Garnet Hill in Glasgow, which I understand has had the same architect as Princess Road and St. Petersburg Place.
Oh, well, Nathan Joseph was involved in Glasgow, actually, as well as in St. Petersburg Place. Well, I don't have to say this, but our survey, we did the whole country, and we did Ireland, and we did the Irish Republic, and we even got as far as Gibraltar. And the stuff I published, I did two editions of a guidebook, Jewish Heritage in England, that actually covered Scotland, Wales, and Ireland as well, and a separate publication on Gibraltar. So I have to say that I think I've been to virtually, if not every single shul and burial ground in Britain and Ireland, which was Jewish site, a few other Jewish sites as well, like schools and trade union buildings and stuff like that, which was built, that survives. It was built before the Second World War. So yeah, and we live in Manchester. Yes, and I agree with you about Council Shul. It's actually been taken over by a Haredi group who've turned the communal hall into rather lavish, actually. They spent a lot of money on it, yeshiva.
Really?
And they were just basically not using the main shul at all because of this perception of the shul being Anglo-Jewish, and it's not their tradition, and they didn't like the fact there wasn't a proper mechitza and things like that. I should say that the new synagogue in Stamford Hill is now, it took years and years. It was on the Heritage Register for about 10 years, and is now the Bobova Shul, which is the largest Hasidic synagogue in Britain. And again, you see what I was trying to explain before about listed buildings. There are restrictions, but it also encourages imaginative ways of adapting buildings. So they put up a high mechitza in Egerton Road, which is sort of reversible. So it's now satisfactory for the Hasidim to use the building, and they're actually quite proud of it now. And Council Shul, I heard recently that they started a minyan in there because they can social distance. So yeah, which gives us some hope.
Right.
And of course, the building was actually repaired under they had a big lottery grant about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And before it closed, or the old congregation sold it. But of course now it needs more work doing on it.
Sure.
But I hope it will survive because it could fulfill all of those functions which I was talking about, of being the big public space for the community.
Do you consider?
We've got 3 other questions to come. We're running out of time.
Right.
Just
Can
a quickie.
you ask your question very quickly and a brief answer?
Yeah. Do you consider Crumpsall and Holy Law and Queen's Road as cathedral type synagogues?
Well, this is. I didn't really. That's why I didn't want to get into this. I will refer you to my.
It's only quick questions.
It's only a quick question. I can basically. Yeah. I mean, in terms of scale, you could say that they are cathedral synagogues. And I mentioned Hampstead before, which is sort of the Edwardian buildings. You could say that they're cathedral in scale, but they might not necessarily conform to the pattern, the basilican pattern of a nave and two aisles. Right. Although, I mean, the idea of having the gallery, I mean, you could see in the 1960s, somewhere like Marble Arch is still basically a cathedral synagogue in that simple sense of being a large, a public space, public worship space.
Right. The next question is from Malcolm.
Yeah. I mean, but you can get different plans. Like Queen's Road, for example, in Withington, which is the one you're talking about, is built on a Greek cross plan. Actually, it's like a hang on, South Manchester Synagogue is.
I'm going to unmute Malcolm.
Right. Yeah, so that was just before the Second World War. But yeah, we can get into this. How you define a cathedral synagogue? I mean, I think the term was most popularly and widely used in association with the late 19th century buildings.
Right. The next question is from Malcolm.
Once you get into the interwar period,
hello. No.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Malcolm.
Yes. Can you see me? Because I don't know if you can see me or not. Anyway, can you hear me?
Yes,
I
we
can
can hear you. Go ahead.
You can hear me? Yes.
Is
Well,
that
I'm
Jonathan?
also.
Is that Jonathan Green?
No, it's Malcolm Lawrence. Malcolm
Oh,
Lawrence.
oh, the other Malcolm. All right, okay. I
Hello,
can't
hello.
see you, but I can hear
I'm
you.
also an ex-Mancunian,
All right.
living in London now. And so I
Yeah.
want to talk about two shuls. When I was young in Manchester, the Holy Law wasn't a cathedral. It was extended on both sides, and the
Yeah.
bimah was moved from in
That's
front of
right,
the Oriental Kadish
Yeah.
into the middle of the shul, and that rather took away the idea of a cathedral, I suppose. Now, I noticed being a member of Edgware for many years, I've been here a long time,
Yeah.
the bimah there was already in the middle. So what is the sort of tradition about having the bimah either by the Oriental Kadish or having it in the middle of the shul?
Now, I deliberately left all this out because I was asked to talk about the United Synagogue. And when things start getting a bit blurred, basically the tradition in Ashkenaz is for the bimah to be in the center of the shul, right? Which goes back to the Rambam, to Maimonides. In the early 19th century, the German reformers moved the bimah to the front of the shul and made a platform, like the duchen and the bimah became one. And then the chazan or the Baal Koreh faced the congregation rather than facing the Aron Kodesh, like addressing the people rather than the Kodesh Baruch Hu. So it became so there were changes in the floor plan, or what's called a liturgical changes, liturgical plan of the building. This became the cathedrals, the big shuls in Central Europe, partly why the Cathedral Synagogue has went out of fashion and has been sort of abused in a way, certainly in the 1990s and into the 2000s, is because of this association with the Reform movement. That a lot of the big shuls, like Doheny and the new synagogue, the Oranienburger Strasse in Berlin, were reformed or slightly reformed. So, but the irony is that then I've written a whole chapter about the Anglo-Jewish Reformation in my book. The West London Synagogue in Upper Berkeley Street, which is also, you could say, a cathedral synagogue, was built with a central bimah, and it was only moved later to the front to make it reform, in keeping with the reform tradition. And then to make things even more complicated, Delissa Joseph, who I deliberately didn't talk about, introduced the Eastern axis, like moving the bimah to the front. In other words, making a kind of everybody facing forward into the United Synagogue in Hampstead. So again, so there's this association of the cathedral synagogues with the reform movement, but actually it's not as clear cut as that at all. And then, of course, in the 19th century as well, there was an edict. There was a meeting of what today we call Haredi rabbis in Hungary, who basically said that the Katan Sofer and some of his, so you're not allowed, it's Ossa, you mustn't go into a building which has got turrets, right? Without a central bimah. And you're not allowed to hold a wedding inside one of these buildings because that's Kukas Goy. And this is what a lot of the revival or the so-called revival of strict orthodoxy in the late 20th century, and what's happening now, certainly here in Manchester, is based on like the Katan Sofer and these kind of rulings, which in a way, sort of there's nothing new in the Torah, this kind of, and you've got to wear your Yiddish, speak the language, the Loshen, and you've got to wear the Jewish dress. There's another one, isn't there? Keep the Jewish name, right? So that's fed in to almost as a reaction, since certainly from the 1980s, really, into, I mean, it's not just in Britain, but in all over the world. And so partly that's why the big shuls have suffered. And I showed you one shul in Poland, which has been restored, which was a big shul. And in a way, it's a simplification of the reality that actually many towns in Eastern Europe where there were big Jewish communities had large synagogues. Some of the Hasidic cults had large, they had quite palatial, like the the Kloisen, like in Prague, which was the rabbinical cult, or the Schulhof in Vilna, both the Misnachdim and the Hasidim had large synagogues. So this idea that everybody davened in these little shtiblach is actually not true. But I might be hounded out of certain parts of North Manchester for saying this.
I believe that
it isn't true. It just isn't if you look at the evidence. So
I believe that West
and weddings were held in synagogues as well in the Middle Ages and things. So and that's sort of gone totally out of fashion.
I believe that West London Reform does have a ladies' gallery.
Sorry? West London, again, in my chapter in West London was built with a ladies' gallery, yes. And it was used by women until I think it was 1933. I was quite shocked when I discovered that. So, and it's got verses from Ancient High around the around the walls, and it can't get more traditional than that, really. So
Jonathan Greenstein is
the penultimate question is from Jonathan Greenstein.
Hi, good evening.
Hello.
First, good evening, Johnny Greenstein. First of all, I want to say your book is wonderful. It's an absolutely amazing book. It's well worth everyone getting it. You mentioned St. Petersburg. I'm an ex-Liverpudlian from Princess Road.
Oh, it's okay.
And and you mentioned St. Petersburg Place. Of course, there's another little brother, which is the Sydney Great. Also designed by.
Right. Yes, yeah.
We sang there.
Wasn't it? Yes.
Right. We sang there about 30 years ago. And I looked at the shul and Rabbi Apple said, yes, it's based on your shul. I want to ask you about organs in shuls. The orderly design in 1872, I think, actually had a big organ right round the choir gallery, all the pipes. Of course, it wasn't built that way.
No, that was one of his schemes, yeah.
Were there any shuls in England, like maybe Hampstead, that actually had in the original design an organ?
No, no, I don't think so. The only one that got built was the West London, and that they've got this marvelous pipe organ.
That was later, though.
That's 1870. West London was opened. So yes, I mean that was very much part of the reform thing. Having
that was Verinder,
which was contrary to halakha. So again, that's in my chapter on the Anglo-Jewish Reformation.
No, but Hampstead voted.
Brought it all up, so thanks.
So didn't Hampstead actually vote to actually have an organ at the beginning?
Let me think. They may have done. I know Hampstead did some quite. They were quite on the sort of the left wing. They certainly had a mixed choir.
Sure.
And I think Princess Road. I think there are still a few old ladies.
Well, Princess Road actually has a mixed choir now, but didn't in the that period.
Yes, and I actually my husband's family came from Stepney, from the East London Synagogue. They had a mixed choir in there up until certainly the 1950s. So after the Second World War, I think when Rabbi Brodie was chief rabbi, they still got away with it. But of course, that would not be allowed at all now. So, but again, that was. Oh, I'm just getting from the other room, 1970s. I'm being corrected. So, but that's it's and again, all of these things which are associated with reform, I suppose, sort of gave the Cathedral Synagogues a bad name, which was not completely deserved. So there's been a shift to the right in the as I'm sure everybody knows in the United Synagogue, because the Adlers came from Germany, and of course they were resisting the reform movement. And sort of, were part of the sort of the modern Orthodox, the Hirschian modern Orthodoxy, the Turin Derech Eretz middle way. And of course, that came in for a big bashing or has come in our lifetimes. So again, it's all, a lot of it is to do with fashion. Even in the supposedly traditionalist, strictly Orthodox communities, a lot of it is not actually. It's a reaction, and isn't always accurate in their perception of what the historical reality was of what life was really like in the shtetl or the ghetto, and how people interacted with the non-Jewish community and things, or the fact that there were, that Jewish buildings which were designed by, you know, synagogues which are designed by church architects, and therefore they were built in Romanesque or even Gothic style in Europe. Gothic, incidentally, was hardly ever used in Britain because it was so strongly associated with Pugin and the church, particularly the Catholic Church, with the Anglican Church as well. So whereas in Germany, there wasn't any compunction about that. So Gothic style was fine for synagogues.
Right, the final question is from Susan Taylor.
Okay,
Susan...
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I can hear somebody. Hello, your Galaxy A1.
Hello, that's me. Yes.
Oh, hello.
I just wanted to say, I thought I'd better tell you that I'm one of Reverend Taylor's daughters-in-law from Dollis Hill Shul.
Oh.
So you might think that I'm biased, but it's got nothing to do with that. Throughout my teenage years, and I never imagined that I was going to marry one of their sons, I used to go there every Shabbos, and it was I wanted to say to you, it was a very vibrant community in the 1960s until people started moving away around about the 1930s. And people loved, you know, they loved Reverend Taylor. They had Rabbi Rabinowitz, was very learned, and Victor Lucas was a chairman there, and he was later important in I think he was president of the United Synagogue. They've had other people who have played a big part in the United Synagogue, and it was a beautiful shul with lovely stained glass windows, and people still talk about it today. They come up to us, and the community that was there, they don't forget about it. So I just wanted to say, as my memories as a teenager it was a wonderful shul. I wouldn't have gone every week. I used to sit with my friends, and they had a choir, and it was wonderful. That's what I wanted to say.
Yes. Oh,
so I've got a different view to you, and I don't know who you spoke to. But there are many people in Edgware who still remember the shul with great love.
Yes,
So there you
I mean, I just wanted
to
inside
tell you
though, when you were young, was the inside sort of bare concrete, or had it been?
Well, we didn't notice that. We didn't notice that because
it was painted and panelled, I think, which perhaps softened it.
Yes.
Which
Well,
perhaps made people.
I don't think we noticed. I don't think we noticed that. We just enjoyed it.
Yeah, enjoy the atmosphere.
So we thought it was lovely. I thought it was lovely, actually.
Yeah. Oh, good.
It wasn't snobby, and it was, it was just a good atmosphere there.
Right.
And I'm sure other people feel that as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
I meat every day. That was all.
Thank you for that observation.
Yeah.
So we're all indebted to Dr. Sharman Kadish for giving us her expert knowledge tonight. We're very fortunate that she gave this very thorough talk, and I'm sure you'll want to read at least one of her books and maybe more of them to absorb everything that she said tonight. I'm going to have to watch it again to make sure that I took in everything that she talked about tonight. Thank you very much. And we have our next session is linked to this because Dr. Sharman Kadish mentioned the Minhag Anglia. Our next session will be on Sunday, the 20th of December at 3 p.m. when we have a live stream session from Jerusalem. Rabbi Raymond Apple, who was at Hampstead, will be giving a lecture on 150 years of the Minhag Anglia. We look forward to welcoming you then. And if you want to see what we have lined up for you in 2021, please go to the Edgware United Synagogue website where you'll find all the sessions until Pesach. So thank you very much again. And Edgware has shown that it cares about the United Synagogue and that we are rounding off the year in great style with the 2 lectures on 150 years of the United Synagogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Sharman Kadish. Thank you, Spencer. I'll say that ends the evening. We will now close the live stream. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
And thank you, Phil, for acting as moderator.
No problem at all. Have a good evening, everybody. Speak to you all soon.